I'm Andrew Bennett. I'm the director of the Religious Freedom Institute's North America Action Team. The mission of the RFI is to achieve broad acceptance of religious liberty as a fundamental human right, the cornerstone of a successful society, and a source for national and international security. We put this mission into practice in the United States and around the world through 5 action teams and our Center for Religious Freedom Education. Today, I will be discussing questions of religious freedom in North America while I interview Dr. Brian Bird, a postdoctoral fellow at Princeton University. Brian, thanks for joining me.
Well, thank you for having me, Andrew. Great to be here.
No, it's a real pleasure, and thank you very much for joining the North America Action Team as our research fellow. It's a real privilege for us.
Oh, it's a real pleasure for me. I really am grateful for the opportunity.
Good, good. So, Brian, as I introduced you, you're the currently the John and Daria Barry postdoctoral research fellow in the James Madison program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. That is quite a mouthful, but it sounds like a wonderful program. You're also a graduate of our shared alma mater of McGill University in Montreal, where you received your PhD in law. So tell me a little bit about your research interests.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you again for the opportunity to be here, and it's a pleasure to be joining the RFI and supporting its very important mission, which you've outlined at the outset of your remarks. And in terms of my research, well, I did my PhD on freedom of conscience as it's understood within the Canadian Constitution, but that required me to go a bit broader than the Canadian Constitution because freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, and related fundamental human rights are protected in many bills of rights, many constitutions, both domestically but also internationally. So I touched on and dealt with freedom of conscience in my doctoral dissertation at McGill in Montreal, and then I also have wider interests in constitutional law more generally, constitutional theory, philosophy of law, constitutional legal history, and comparative constitutional law. So one of the wonderful things about being at Princeton this year in the James Madison program, as you mentioned, which focuses on American constitutional law as well as kind of Western political thought, is it's allowed me to do a lot of kind of comparative thinking and a bit of writing and research in that area of kind of comparative constitutionalism and looking at those kinds of issues through that kind of a lens.
Now, have you sort of confined yourself to the Anglosphere, or have you explored a little bit more widely?
It's been mainly U.S., Canada for the moment. In part, I'm a Canadian by kind of in terms of being raised in Canada, trained in Canada mainly. I did a bit of postgraduate work in the UK, but I don't have too much. I didn't come into this with too much knowledge or very deep knowledge of American constitutional law, but that has changed very rapidly through being steeped in it here, not only through research, but even doing a bit of teaching, TAing for a course on civil liberties, which has allowed me to get steeped into how the U.S. constitutional order treats these issues such as religious freedom. So mainly U.S., Canada, but looking forward to perhaps branching out even further.
Fantastic. So as you said, you've written a lot about the relationship between religious freedom and freedom of conscience. And as a fellow Canadian, you'll know very well that Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms explicitly links conscience and religion in the first of the fundamental freedoms that are listed in Section 2. So for our viewers, can you briefly talk about, is there a clear relationship that we can discern between conscience and religion, and why perhaps in the Canadian context are they put together, are they bound together like that?
Sure, that's a great question. It's really kind of was the kind of springboard question for my doctorate. I went into it wanting to do something on freedom of religion in Section 2 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but then realized pretty quickly in my very, very preliminary research that there was this other prong, conscience, which was pretty much absent from the jurisprudence. Not much had been really, basically nothing had been done on it, both in the scholarship and in the actual kind of case law. Mm-hmm. And so I don't think it's an accident that conscience and religion are together. I mean, part of the reason is likely to do with the influences of the drafting of the Charter. There's quite a clear link between the drafting of the Charter, its text, and some international human rights instruments, such as the the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and others that put conscience and religion together. In addition to thought, freedom of thought is often put together with conscience and religion. And indeed, actually, in the drafting of the Charter, thought was also with conscience and religion, but for one reason or another was dropped down to another fundamental freedom, coupled with belief and opinion and freedom of expression and freedom of the press. But why conscience and religion? Why did they end up being kind of neighbors in the same provision? Well, there's a decision I've really liked from the Supreme Court of Canada called Edward Books, dealt with it was kind of a Sunday closing law for shopping kind of decision in that vein. And a judge in that decision said that the purpose of Section 2A of the Charter, which protects conscience and religion, is to protect profoundly personal beliefs that govern one's understanding of the universe, of meaning, of kind of these big questions in life. And some of those questions may point towards a higher being, some of them may not for some people. But this idea of kind of, the big questions of who are we, why are we here, how are we to live, how are we supposed to live with one another? I think conscience and religion both kind of speak to those issues, and they're all bundled up with that.
Right. So I mean, we could sort of maybe use an example where someone with, let's say, a deep Christian faith would say that, I believe that I should treat my fellow human beings in this way because of my belief in the incarnation of Jesus Christ, and that's obviously a religious belief. But someone who is a secular humanist or an atheist would also ascribe to this idea that I need to treat my fellow citizens, my fellow human beings with respect and with a particular ethic. And that obviously does not stem from a religious belief system, but is fundamental to their conscience. Like I believe that this is an ethic that I need to adhere to. Is that kind of maybe broadly speaking the distinction?
Yeah, I mean, the distinction I drew in my doctorate was that freedom of conscience, looking at it alone before looking at freedom of religion, protects moral judgments, the fruit of moral reasoning, regardless of whether those moral judgments come through religious formation or religious kind of traditions, or whether it comes through some other kind of just maybe more kind of pure reasoning without reference to a catechism or a scriptural resource, a holy book for that matter. So you could have, as you kind of gave a good example of two comparators, you could also think of, the secular pacifist who doesn't want to go to war, thinks that war is immoral, and then look at many Christian denominations, think of Mennonites or Quakers who also hold the similar belief. They may even actually, when into the fundamentals of why they think war is immoral, they might actually have a lot of common ground, but they got there through different vehicles. In the healthcare context, it also applies, when you're thinking of issues like abortion or euthanasia, you could have the kind of religiously informed conscience. You could also have the non-religiously informed conscience, two doctors coming at it from different angles. And I think what's interesting about conscience is I think almost everyone would agree that we all have a conscience. It's kind of like an innate human characteristic. So it kind of speaks very clearly to our shared humanity.
And that's a really interesting point. I've been really enjoying reading some of the works by Jay Buzashevsky, and I think you and I have chatted about him in the past. And he has this wonderful book, What We Can't Not Know, which is a really accessible presentation of natural law theory, in which he really seeks to root it outside of a religious tradition, that it exists outside of religious tradition as well as inside. I mean, he's very clearly a Catholic writer, and he states so explicitly. But he speaks about this idea of deep conscience, that as the title of the book sort of insinuates, there are certain things we simply can't not know. So do you think that is that really an understanding that is held to in the public square, or do you think that that's being constrained in some way?
That's a very good question. You mentioned that book. I was actually thinking of it as I was preparing, kind of reflecting for this interview. So I think it's very appropriate. This idea of these moral norms, some moral absolutes that we can't ignore, that we can't deny, or we can deny, but by doing it, we're suppressing our conscience. Has it been? Is there something? Well, one of the big things I'll say is that interestingly, conscience is not really being given enough airtime, I think, in the public square. I think in Canada, certainly. In the US, it's an interesting situation because, of course, the Bill of Rights, the US Constitution, that is, doesn't explicitly mention conscience. It refers to the free exercise of religion. And any kind of mentions or discussions of conscience that we see in the founding era with the founding fathers seems to be more to do with religious conscience, or at least religiously informed conscience, really, really tying up those two concepts together, which is understandable. But I think that there needs to be more space made for conscience, because a lot of the hot button issues, a lot of the issues that seem to get to the Supreme Courts of both the United States and Canada and other countries, I think are often moral issues or conscience issues. Maybe we've arrived at them in court through religion. I think of conscientious objection in healthcare. A lot of the cases are religious healthcare professionals, or we're dealing with same-sex marriage. We're dealing with the baker who doesn't want to make the cake for that ceremony. It's coming from a religious kind of standpoint. But nonetheless, I think we'd all agree that, or many would agree, that a lot of these issues are almost inevitably or unavoidably moral. Life and death, marriage itself, relationships, very intimate human relationships, sexuality, and yet conscience is kind of lacking in terms of not being given enough airtime. Why that is, I don't know. Maybe we've just spent a lot of time on religion and maybe developed a bit of a blind spot.
That's interesting, the blind spot of conscience. Is this something that you're maybe hoping to expand a little bit on? Are you doing some work in this area right now, or?
Well, not specifically now. I'm still kind of taking it in some ways a bit of a breather from that topic after the PhD, but it's something I'm obviously deeply interested in, and I think that there's a lot of work that can be done on it. One of the reasons I was excited about the PhD was I hope that it might be a bit of an icebreaker, so to speak, or things that have spun out of it, articles, kind of more kind of op-eds, things like that. But there might be a chance for maybe a book down the road. Let's see. That's a big task, but I think there's a lot to be said about. I mean, one thing I should say, I don't mean to jump around, is maybe one of the reasons why courts are worried about getting into freedom of conscience, that is that maybe it does almost force them to have to, as judges, deal with the arguments on both sides, and it really does get them into almost unavoidably into moral debates. And some people will say, well, that's simply the task they've been given, but I'm not. Sometimes I say to myself, I don't envy the role of judges in having to interpret these big concepts like freedom, equality, dignity, justice. These are tall orders, and I can see why they might be a bit reluctant to go down that road. But I think when we're dealing with these big questions, which we have to grapple with, we have to grapple with them.
Absolutely. Well, let's go to some of these, the whole idea of big questions. And big questions are treated differently, it seems, at times between Canada and the United States. And we're two Canadians that are currently connected with organizations and institutions in the United States. And I always sort of joke with my American friends that we walk among them. They don't always know that we're there. But so let's explore the Canada-US dynamic a little bit. Certainly, I think we can agree that religious freedom is fundamental to both Canadian and American democracy and the democratic experience in both countries. But to what extent do you believe this is appreciated by most citizens? Do you think that people really have a sense of this fundamental freedom and how it lives at this sort of core of our democracy?
It's a good question. I've been trying to. One of the benefits of being here in the US for a year is to try to get a sense of that. I mentioned comparative constitutionalism, but also kind of a comparative sense of how maybe Canadians and Americans treat this freedom. My sense is, to be perfectly honest so far, and maybe this is a kind of a boring answer in a way, is that I think actually there's a lot of similarity. If I had to look at kind of the trajectory that freedom of religion has had in both countries in maybe recent decades, is I think there seems to be a general kind of, if I can use the word, maybe suspicion of religion, of it's not only, I mean, maybe kind of its value. We've seen a lot of questions of why is it given, or why is it afforded constitutional protection in the first place? Why is it valuable? Why does it make the cut for bills of rights? I think those questions have, in both countries, grown in previous years. And I get the sense that there's been more of a, maybe compared to other freedoms, freedom of speech or freedom of expression, equality, other areas of kind of bills of rights and constitutional rights, more suspicion of religion. And I think that holds true in both. Maybe in one country that suspicion has grown quicker than others. Maybe it's a rate of acceleration. Maybe that differs a bit, but I get the sense, kind of the broad kind of concern of why is this a valuable thing? And this is why maybe the Religious Freedom Institute is so important, to try to educate us to why this is such an important freedom, not just for people who happen on a given day say that they're religious, but for society itself in broad brushstrokes.
I think you're right. I think the understanding of religious freedom is very similar between the two countries. Obviously, we have our own founding myths, and the United States coming out of that Enlightenment era, whereas Canada is really formed by kind of high Tory ideals, a very strong sort of statist maybe idea. But what about how religious freedom, and you've touched on this, I think, sort of implicitly, how religious freedom is being lived out in the two countries. And one thing I've noticed when I've been in the United States is that there is a very palpable sense of a civic religion in the United States. And certainly it's very common for public figures, for elected officials to invoke God, God bless America, and so forth. Whereas I think you would agree that you never hear that really in Canada. It's not a feature, I would say, of our civil discourse. So what's your sense of that? How would you say the experience of religious freedom is being lived out in the two countries right now?
Sure. I mean, those are very, very good points. I think that we speak about maybe more in the U.S. and Canada, this idea of the separation of church and state, and yet you don't see the separation of church and politics or religion and politics as much in the U.S. as you do in Canada. I think you're absolutely right that for one reason or another, there's this reticence or this this kind of reluctance to invoke religion in a very kind of unabashed way in public discourse in Canada as compared to the U.S. It seems to be much more accepted, much more, and maybe that speaks to a deeper acceptance of the importance of this fundamental freedom. Maybe a bit of it is tradition over years, and it's certain, the God bless America has become a very, things like that have become very part of the kind of almost civic religion. Yeah. But I do think that you're right, that it speaks to, at some level, a willingness to allow religious arguments or religious discourse to have a more prominent place in the U.S. as compared to Canada. Maybe part of it is, I don't know, maybe the kind of stereotypical kind of Canadian politeness to kind of not, speak about certain things at the public square table, so to speak. But I jest a bit. But I think you're right. We touched on something important there.
Well, maybe just expanding a little bit, and you've already hinted at this in talking about conscience rights and where some of these moral questions are coming to the fore. But what would you say are some of the most pressing challenges to religious freedom in Western democracies such as the U.S. and Canada? What are maybe some of the trends that we're seeing between our two countries?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think that, as I kind of touched on before, you're right. I think just this general maybe suspicion of religion and its value in the public square, of what it has to offer to this idea of building a common life together, of even working towards the common good or towards the good. I think that suspicion has to be met, and through work like what the RFI is doing and has been doing for a while, that's very important. Speaking to the value of religious freedom, why, as I said before, it makes the cut. It wasn't an accident that it got into things like the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, to basically every major human rights instrument across the world. That's not a coincidence. It's not even just kind of holding true to tradition. There's something there that religion speaks to, and that, I think, is a big issue. And I think another part of the struggle is needing to kind of meet I mentioned that conscience seems to be actually a lot of times at the front lines of a lot of the big issues that we think of as religious freedom issues today. I mentioned in healthcare, and in marriage, in a variety of other spheres, the family. Religious freedom is very important, but I think there needs to be more room for the conscientious aspect of the importance of moral reasoning. Maybe for one reason or another, it seems like moral reasoning is not really spoken of as much as it should be in the public square. The moral content of law itself seems to be sometimes underplayed. But we would all agree, I would hope, most would agree, that there's inevitably moral content to law. We're trying to build, I hope we'd all agree, a good society, a moral society, an equitable society. And so conscientious reasoning, moral reasoning, which can be informed often by religion, has to be more, I think, more airtime. I used that phrase before, needs to be given to it. That's just super important.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think sometimes we maybe miss some of the opportunities to do that. And, often you talked about, the sort of politeness of Canadians, that sometimes I think as citizens, we kind of step back from engaging in public debate on some of these issues because we're afraid maybe of causing offense, or we're afraid of stepping on some moral landmines. And we want to just kind of keep things kind of nice and flat, and we don't want to rock the boat at all. But what can you say about the need to engage one another in our deep differences? And sometimes these deep differences have some sharp corners to them. But if we're going to sort of build a common life together, it seems to me that those debates need to take place. And there seems to be an anthropological aspect to this, that we need to recognize in each other our shared personhood, our shared human dignity, as maybe the touchstone for having those debates. So what do you think are maybe some opportunities to realize the space that does exist for us in the United States and Canada to sort of re-encounter one another? And maybe coming out of this pandemic, we're being presented with a rather unique opportunity in this regard to re-encounter one another and to engage in deep, meaningful sort of pluralism.
That's a great question. It's a big topic, but I think as a starting point, there needs to be a kind of a reorientation of kind of how we view the other side. I mean, for both sides, how they view the other side on any given debate. I mean, these topics that often, kind of are hot button topics are controversial. They're very contested. They touch on some very important, core, delicate areas of our lives. And so it's not surprising that the temperature can rise pretty quickly. And I think that maybe a good starting point is to really kind of take a step back and for us to remind all of us that we all want, I think, to seek the good, to get the right answer to these questions. And maybe we have to avoid the tendency, and I think this has happened on both sides, to kind of demonize the other side. It's easy, because of how contentious and delicate these topics are, is to think that how could someone on the other side think what they think? And then before you know it, we're just not really talking to each other anymore. We're talking past each other. And kind of we're pressing mute, for lack of a better way of putting it, and just letting the person talk, and then we move on. I think we've become very entrenched. And that's to a certain extent understandable, given how delicate these issues are. But I think we need to take a step back, both sides, and really try. And how do we do this? It really takes, frankly, goodwill and recognizing that reasonable people of good faith can disagree on these issues. And if we start there, there's a better chance of maybe reaching the right answers, or at least common ground, and recognizing that we're trying to get things right.
And I think at Princeton, you've got a wonderful model there of Robbie George and Cornel West, and their interactions that they've had, where they obviously disagree on a lot of issues, but there is this common sense that there is a goal for these debates, and that is to hopefully build a better society and to build up this common life. So I think that's a really important point, and certainly at the RFI, we're really trying to further these dialogues. We do it a lot overseas, and now with the North America Action Team, which is sort of just getting off the ground, we hope to engage a little bit more in the domestic space. So Brian, thank you very much for joining me today, and really glad that you've come on as our research fellow, and we look forward to many further such discussions in the days ahead.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, Andrew.
Great. Thanks very much. To learn more about RFI's work to secure religious freedom for everyone, everywhere, please visit rfi.org. You can also follow us on social media.